Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jessica McCall, and I'm a principal with the Raben Group. And this time last year, the country was at a standstill. For those of us who were in a position to shelter in place and weren't grocery store clerks, or those who deliver our mail, and other frontline workers and first responders, we were on the heels of 2 months indoors and weeks away from learning that something as simple as a pod of a few friends could provide the escape that we all desperately needed. If we were lucky, we didn't get COVID at all. If we were blessed, we survived if we did. Everything we knew had seemingly come to a halt, and we were living in a world of uncertainty that had no end in sight. Then came May 26th, less than 24 hours after Darnella Frazier, at the time a 17-year-old Minneapolis high school student, captured a video of a man, a brother, a father, George Floyd, being murdered on the streets of Minneapolis by 4 police officers. The world collectively gasped as we watched the horrific video of Mr. Floyd calling out for his mama as he took his last breaths. Less than 48 hours after Mr. Floyd's death, protests erupted throughout the country. And by May 30th, from a basement in Delaware, Joe Biden, at that point having secured the Democratic nomination for president, released a statement on both Mr. Floyd and the violence that had accompanied some of the demonstrations. The United States was in the thick of its most consequential presidential election, a pandemic that at its peak was killing more people per day than died on September 11th. And for the first time in over half a century, our country's ongoing crisis with race captured the attention of the majority of white America. And in the months ahead, their outrage and calls for change would lead to a yet to be determined progress for those most affected by inequity, inequality, and police brutality. And my guest today captures it all. Isaac Dovere, a staff writer for The Atlantic and the author of the new book, Battle for the Soul: Inside the Democrats' Campaigns to Defeat Trump. And now joining me is Isaac. Isaac, welcome.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for having me. And I should start by apologizing for the hostage video background here that I've got. Room Raider will not be happy. I do have a whole setup at home with the book in the background and flowers and all sorts of things. But I was scheduled to do something with Jake Tapper that got rescheduled because of the shooting. And so you are seeing me from a small office in the CNN headquarters.
That's all right. I am going for a 10 on Room Raider, just so they know.
I mean, totally.
I've got checked all the criteria, I think. So I even put the cords away. So we'll see how it goes. So why in the world would you want to revisit 2020?
I started working on this book. I started thinking about writing a book in 2017 about what was going on, and played with a couple of ways to go at it, and looking at the politics of this moment that we were in then, and that clearly we were going to continue to be in. And in the proposal that got bought in the summer of 2018, I had spelled out, it said this is going to be the most consequential election ever. It's going to be the craziest election ever. And that was what I thought before I knew anything that was coming with the pandemic or the economic crisis, or obviously everything that happened in the weeks after Floyd's death, and this racial reckoning that we started to go through, or the crisis of democracy that we're continuing to go through. And some of the threads of that were there, but to how it all bubbled up in 2020 was beyond what I could have imagined. I do think, though, that the original impetus continues, though, throughout, which is that the Democratic Party is one of the 2 major parties in America, right? It's going to be, now it's the party that's in power. But one way or the other, what this process was of a party that was decimated going into 2016 in a way that people didn't really realize until the 2016 results happened. And I'm not just talking Donald Trump's election. I'm talking about the Senate races. Remember, there were so many people who assumed like Ron Johnson's going to lose to Russ Feingold. That's done. They're starting to think like, hey, are the Democrats going to win that Senate race in North Carolina? None of that happened. And the House, and you go back, and this is part of what I trace in the book, and you look at the beginning of the Obama presidency to the end of the Obama presidency in terms of state legislature seats. It's almost 1,000 seats that were in Democratic hands in 2008, that were in Republican hands by 2016. So following that, and seeing how the Democratic Party came together and tried to refashion itself into what it was going to be, and the struggle for it that continued in all sorts of crazy ways and continues now, is what this book is about. And it's told through the crazy stories of the campaign and the candidates and the characters that were involved.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go back to May 26, 2020. And, we all woke up to the horrific video of Mr. Floyd being murdered. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, as you already know that you're going to be writing this book, and what are some of the thoughts you began to have? One, how long did it take you to watch the video? It took me weeks.
Yeah, it was, in fact, not until I was, I think we should all, as human beings, have trouble watching a video like that. If you can watch a video like that and be okay, then there might be, should maybe see a therapist of some sort. It's, you should never want to see anything like that happen, and especially it's not just a human life being taken, but what is going into that, and the struggle that Floyd was going through. And in the book, I recreate this moment when Keith Ellison, who's now the Attorney General of Minnesota and was obviously then overseeing the Chauvin trial, as he watched it. And Ellison, remember, when he was a member of Congress, represented the House district that Floyd was killed in. And he's watching it, and he's going through and he watches it again. And he just, he's a guy who's been involved in civil rights cases and all sorts of work in his district. And he says to his wife, who's from Columbia, like, you've got to see this.
Yeah.
And she says to him, like, I grew up with gang wars and people being killed on the streets.
Right.
And I don't need to watch something else. And he watches it, and it catches him that Floyd is calling out for his mom, and he takes notes on it. And then he drives down to the site of where Floyd was killed, which already by one day later, that the midday when he was there were a lot of people there. And then he has to start processing it, not just as a Black man in America or as a political leader, but then what is it going to mean as the Attorney General, and how he's going to have a role in this. And of course, we see what some of that role was, but it's a critical moment, obviously, not just for him or for Minnesota, but for the country overall. And one of the prominent members of this country is Joe Biden, who then was he watched the video himself. And he was trying to figure out what to do about this. And this is, like, Joe Biden has been in politics a very long time, right? Yeah. He talks about how he saw the riots in Delaware after Martin Luther King was killed. He talks about, there's a story he tells of standing on the train platform, waiting for that train that Obama got on in Philadelphia and rode to Washington for the inauguration, standing there with his sons, with Hunter and Beau, and seeing the same blocks that were on fire in the riots, 40 years before that. And then waiting for the first Black president to pick him up and ride to their inauguration together. He thinks about all this stuff, but even so, what happened last year had a major, major effect on him, in part because of just consuming it as a presidential candidate, as the nominee, essentially, at that point. But then he has this connection that he makes with Floyd's daughter, Gianna, when he goes to see the family. Joe Biden loss is a big part of how he's wired, right? And to think about the car crash that took his wife and his baby daughter in 1972, and then his son, and thinking it's just always there with him, and he connects with her, and he and he. She says what the story that he's told a bunch of times since then publicly. My daddy's going to change the world, and there's a connection that way. But there's also a connection when he listens to what Ben Crump and Al Sharpton are talking about backstage, and then in the eulogies. And Sharpton says, we all feel a knee on our necks.
Yes.
And Biden says, yeah, I never thought of it that way.
Right.
And then a couple days later, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's his approach to race.
Yeah, and just to think like that, it just hits him harder personally, as I think it did for a lot of white Americans, honestly, to see it. And it felt so visceral. The power of video, and we know this from the original civil rights era, right? Like seeing things on screen changes how people think about it. Yeah. And then there's this moment that I describe in the book a couple days later when some of the protests were turning violent, and Sharpton publicly condemned the violence. Yes. And Biden and Sharpton are trading calls, and Sharpton, by the way, was very skeptical of Biden as a candidate. As a report in the book, there was a moment right before the South Carolina primary where he was ready to endorse Bernie Sanders, and then he pulled back. And when he gets on the phone, Biden says to Sharpton, "I thank you for saying that, for condemning the violence. It's not helpful to our cause." And it really hits Sharpton that it's our cause, not the cause or your cause or the Floyd cause, but our cause. And Biden, even at 77 years old and all the life that he led, puts himself inside of it then in a way that he hadn't been before. Absolutely.
And Sharpton pulled back really out of respect for Congressman Jim Clyburn, correct?
Respect. It's sort of respect, but also political savvy, right? Like he knew you don't go up against Jim Clyburn in South Carolina. That's a bad move. And so Sharpton didn't want to be on the other side of Clyburn. He said to Sanders backstage at this event, "I'm ready. I just need to talk to my board at National Action Network and make sure that we're going to do it." And then it's right after that Clyburn endorses Biden, and Sharpton's like, okay, maybe not.
Right. I think Jim Clyburn was surprised by how much influence he ended up having on the race.
I mean, he's told me that he was surprised by it, that he thought that it would be, look, he's a good politician with a healthy ego, as all politicians are, and he thought it would be important and hopefully in what he was doing critical, but it had, and I can tell you, having spent that week in South Carolina, such a reverberating effect in South Carolina politics. There was a meeting that Pete Buttigieg was supposed to have with a bunch of mayors. That was not an endorsement event, but it was also like they were supposed to sit around, and it would have been helpful for Buttigieg's campaign to have a bunch of mayors pictured with him. By the way, Buttigieg was having a problem with black voters. They were like a number of black mayors, right? And right before it's supposed to happen, like a couple hours, they cancel the meeting because they're like, even though we weren't going to endorse him, like, Clyburn's with Biden now. And it just like, it amplifies this huge way. And that's why that Clyburn endorsement was not just important, but super important. And how that redounds into the races that Biden always thought he'd win South Carolina. Everybody always thought he would, but he wins it by a lot. He wins it by 50. He gets 50% of the vote, and Bernie Sanders' total of the vote in South Carolina, his percentage goes down from 2016. He got a higher percentage in 16 than in 20, and that huge win, and then the rest of the candidates are like way far back. That huge win, of course, South Carolina is the Saturday before Super Tuesday. It's 3 days before. There's a reason that chapter in the book is called 72 Hours That Changed History, because it really, that's it. That's the whole everything. There's a 500-page book, and a lot of things that I didn't even get to in that 500 pages. It's not all about the primary campaign, but really it's condensed into those 72 hours when it all changes.
Right. Yeah. And there's something that I am really interested in what your reporting says. you talked about Buttigieg having trouble connecting with Black America, and Sanders had a similar problem. And a comment that stuck out for me in the book was Fletcher Smith, the former state rep in North Carolina, who said, when you connect as a white guy with Black people, it convinces white people that you're good too. So how did Biden have that? Well, we actually know how Biden had that, some of that.
Yeah.
What were Buttigieg and Sanders missing?
Well, and by the way, like, it wasn't just Buttigieg and Sanders. And one of the points that I make in the book is that the Pete Buttigieg campaign was a masterpiece of communication strategy. And the one giant failing that they had was they let this narrative set in that Pete Buttigieg had a problem with Black people. Mm-hmm. And he did. But also, so did everybody else who wasn't Joe Biden. So did Bernie Sanders, so did Elizabeth Warren. By the way, so did Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Deval Patrick. They all had a problem with Black people.
Yeah.
And Biden, even when things were going really, really badly for him in the primary campaign in the fall of 2019, and a point when, like, to go back and revisit it as I do in the book, it's like hard to believe that he was so much on the ropes then. But he was. Even at that point, he was being floated in the polls by the consistent, unbreakable support he had with Black voters, more than anything with older Black voters, with voters who were connecting with him as Barack Obama's vice president, but also were connecting with him as the guy who could beat Trump, and who weren't voters who were not really willing to play around and think like, this is a candidate I believe in, or there's an ideological reason for me to go this way or that way. But they were just saying, we got to get rid of Trump. Biden seems like the safest choice. I'm with them. I'm with him, rather. And, you know, that carries all the way through the Saturday before the election in November. I was in Miami, and Kamala Harris was doing a bunch of events. And Fat Joe, not an older Black voter, was on stage. And he says to the crowd, you know, Joe Biden was there for Barack Obama, and now we've got to be there for him. And it's that same connection carrying through.
Right. So let's talk about polls for a minute.
Sure.
You know, as a former campaign person, I always appreciated in 2008, I was on the road. In 2012, I was in headquarters. And I wanted to pull my hair out being in headquarters, because there's something about being on the trail that gives you a really great sense of how you're doing. And I'm wondering if, you know, are campaign managers and are people spending too much time in headquarters? Are we relying too heavily on polls and data and just need to get out on the trail a little bit more?
Well, like, there are a couple of campaign managers in this campaign who spend too much time on the road. And it led to some problems in the management of the campaign. There were some complaints from the Bernie Sanders campaign that his campaign manager, Faz Shakir, was on the road very often with Sanders. He was building a relationship with Sanders that wasn't there, and that's why that was important. He felt like that was the best strategic choice. But so for campaign managers, I think that's tricky, because they probably have pretty complicated organizations to run. It is definitely true, though, that you get a totally different sense of a campaign when you're out in the field or out on the road. I repeatedly would come back to the newsroom in DC after having been in Iowa or New Hampshire or wherever else, and I would say, like, Biden's struggling, or Warren looks like something's happening out there. And maybe actually the one that was the hardest for people to understand is into the fall of 2019, the reporters who were in Iowa especially could see that Kamala Harris was not attracting support anymore, that people weren't showing up to her events. And because she is who she is, she was always talked about as a top tier candidate. And I know I'm sitting in the CNN headquarters now, but in the green rooms and on the sets of cable TV, it was like, Kamala Harris, she's huge, whatever. And those of us who were out on the field were like, this is not happening. She's in trouble. And so there were a lot of people who were shocked when she pulled out of the race right after Thanksgiving in 2019. I will tell you, as the one who broke that story that she was dropping out, I was not shocked, and I say that not as any offense to her, but we could see what was going wrong with the campaign.
Right. So let's dig in there. Do Democrats know how to run presidential races for women, especially Black women? I feel like if someone gave me a Black woman, Black and an Indian woman from Howard University, I really could have done something with that.
Well, I mean, like I point out in the book, right? Like it's more than that separates her from the average lived experience of Americans, right? She has no children of her own. She's married to a Jewish lawyer. It's all these things. She's from San Francisco. It's craziness, right? When you think about how different it is from how most people, just like the average story in America. And I think if you go back to Obama in 2008, I'm not the first person to say this, but a big help to him was his family.
Yeah.
Right. And people would look at him and they would say, like, okay, like that's a Black guy. That's, very different. Right. But they would look at his family and say, well, like he seems to have 2 nice daughters and a nice wife. And even the people who were a little bit spooked by Michelle Obama would connect with that. And that. So I think it's hard. And, I go back sometimes and think about something that Jennifer Palmieri, who was the communications director for Hillary Clinton's campaign, has said, which is that it's hard for us to picture a woman as president. She's talking about Black people specifically, but about women. She says it's hard for us to picture a woman as president because we've never done it.
Right.
Never right. You think about with Obama, when it was really important. He obviously wanted to win in 2008, but he thought winning re-election was really important too, because he couldn't be the Black president who failed, because then there'd never be another Black president. It was like the kind of formulation. And he had to hold himself to a higher standard because he knew he was being held up by so many people, whether they realized it or not, as okay, you're the Black guy. And it like that's being president is already really, really hard. And that was another layer on top of it. So with Harris, look, we will see what it's like perhaps in the future for her to run for president. We don't know if she will. I think it's a safe bet that she probably will at some point again. But she was held to stranger standards than I think she was expecting. And I try to trace in the book some of the ways that was coming up as an issue for her.
Yeah, and one of the biggest issues that stood out for me was one of her staffers said that they, tried to keep her from being too blackety black. And it's the same thing that happened to Michelle Obama early on. And, you send Michelle Obama out to do push-ups with Ellen. And how do you, what is this fear? And it's totally fine if you don't have an answer to this, but like, what is this fear with letting Black women just be their authentic selves and stop, pushing it away in an effort to make us more palatable for mainstream audiences?
I mean, it's the sort of basic rules of politics of relating to as many people as possible, and that it's again like people. It's not a great trait of human beings, but they like what is more familiar to them than what is less familiar to them, right? That quote about the Harris staffer is from someone as she's thinking about as she's already on the ticket, right? And thinking ahead to the vice presidency. It's been I've written about this last week. I wrote an article about her beginnings as vice president, which is not from the book, and there's more recent stuff in the first couple months of being vice president. There's a constant push on her by all sorts of things. And one of the people that I quoted in that story last week is Kim Foxx, who's the Cook County attorney in Illinois, but Chicago essentially. As a Black woman, when she was elected, Harris reached out, and there started to be like a loose mentoring relationship, like not like checking in every week. But one of the things that Fox said to me is that I'm probably not going to do her quote exact justice, but that we think a lot about breaking the glass ceiling and how, and there's a lot of attention to that, and there's a lot less attention to the cuts that it leaves on your head.
Yes. Yes, I feel that. So I know you might get pulled at any moment, and I want to get a sense: are we concerned still about democracy? President Obama, when he was talking to John Legend, he says, and he's talking about the 2020 campaign, and he says the stakes in this one, I don't have to tell you, are higher than you think they are. And he knows what we don't know, about how, Putin and Russia were, all the things that you shared in this book that the general public just doesn't know about what they kept from happening. Like, we don't know what that, surprise was going to be, and thank goodness. But I feel like the stakes are still pretty high. Like, is democracy in trouble?
The short answer is probably. Democracy is certainly on the line. That quote, when Obama says that to John Legend, he's speaking at a fundraiser for the House Democrats that happened to be on the Sunday night after John Lewis died. John Lewis died on a Friday night, remember? And obviously we all knew he was sick. Obama, the connection that he had to Lewis was very intense. And there are moments in the book, basically John Lewis's last public appearance is for an Obama Foundation, My Brother's Keeper event. And they're both speaking there. And that's after Floyd is killed, and Lewis draws a direct connection between the Floyd protesters and all the people showing up in the streets and what was going on in the civil rights era, as basically only John Lewis could, given that who he was. The working title of this book was "Your Right to Be Concerned," and that was a quote that Obama said at a different fundraiser that I was at in 2018, in the spring of 2018. That he was in Beverly Hills with Tom Perez, speaking at a DNC fundraiser. I think one of the things you see from him in the book, and there's been a lot of attention to the cursing and other choice words that he had for Donald Trump. But what it got at to me was that he was going through a process of thinking about what was going on in the country that tracked pretty well with what a lot of Democrats were going through, and I think a lot of the country overall, in thinking about how worried to be, thinking about Trump and how he was coming across. I don't think anybody was under the impression before my book came out that Obama was a Trump voter. Right. But to see what it is that's getting him, when there's I won't use the exact curses on this because I don't know how, it's a family live stream here, but but he calls Trump, in a sort of aside, he calls him a corrupt MFer when he hears about Trump not having aides on the phone when he's talking to foreign leaders. And Obama's like, what is going on there? Right. What is he up to? And I think a lot of us were thinking that, like, why would you do that? Right. He calls him a racist, sexist pig. Like, I think what we've seen in polling data is actually even a lot of Trump supporters will say, like, yeah, I know he's a racist and a sexist, but I still connect with him over how he's fighting for me or the policies, right? Like, I like everything else, and so I'm willing to write that off. So Obama's not like really far out on a limb. Yeah, it's cursing from a former president. That's always going to get people going. And I knew that when I put the words in the book. I'm not like blind to it. But the title evolved from "Your Right to Be Concerned" because as Biden emerged as the nominee and then won, it became that phrase that was so much part of how he ran his campaign, that started with an essay that he writes after Charlottesville, where he says we're in a battle for the soul of this nation, right? Which in Charlottesville is the seminal moment for him. It's the moment when it changes and he decides to run. And even though he didn't really get going for a while afterwards, but he knows then that he's probably going to run. And I interviewed him for the book at the beginning of February, and I said to him, it's his first interview as president. We hadn't talked for a while. Not that I should, he's the president of the United States. He shouldn't talk to me all that often anyway. Right. But I said to him, so, we just landed on, we were changing the title. It's going to be Battle for the Soul. So, that's obviously because of you. And he said, yeah, the difference between you and me, pal, is I actually believe it. And, people forget that Biden has this sarcastic sense of humor. And I said to him, sir, actually, I think you may have been onto something.
Yeah.
And I think, but I think he was onto something more than he realized. This is a presidency that he has in front of him, and all the crises that he's got, and also what he sees as all the opportunities that he has to do more than just be a reset or a placeholder from Trump. Are things that he could not have imagined when he got into the race. He pointed out to me in the interview that he has the Franklin Roosevelt portrait in the most prominent spot in the Oval Office, hanging right over the fireplace. Mm-hmm. And people have asked me this, like, who might he have had over the fireplace if not for all this? I don't know. Maybe something like Harry Truman or something. But But FDR he sees himself in a real historical moment that's important in a way. And I read in the book that he knows his presidency, as we talked about, with black voters, with the connection to Democrats that had to him, that he was elevated to vice president. He knows it's in part a function of Obama. And he knows his presidency is in part a function of Trump and people who just wanted Trump out of office and wanted him to be the guy to beat Trump. He knows that, but he is determined now to not let that be his place in history, to carve out a much bigger place for himself.
Right. And, I was thinking about chapter 11 that you open up with about Andrew Yang. And, for Biden, considering his age and as horrible as the pandemic has been, running for president is grueling. And, I read that opening paragraph and I was like, yeah, Andrew, it's a BFD. Like, what did you think?
Well, Andrew Yang, is a guy who gets into things, who got into this presidential race, not thinking it would even move as much as it did for him, and it took off in a way that nobody could have anticipated. But yeah, look, you see when Obama is thinking about the field in the early days, he's making comments to people like, the president's a grueling job. It's gonna be hard it's hard if you're a younger man, if you're older. And everybody's like, he's not naming names, but everybody's like, hey, we get it. Mr. President, we know who you're talking about. And he is skeptical that Biden can do it, that Biden can connect with people, that Biden can have the political and emotional connection that was there. And Jen Psaki, who was Obama's communications director at the end of his time as president, and now, of course, is Biden's press secretary. We talked last summer before she knew that that she was going to be working in the Biden White House. And she said to me, Obama always underestimated Biden's political skills because they're so different from his own. And it's true both ways. There's a moment in the book that I quote Biden when he's on Air Force Two talking to people at one point as vice president, and he says about Obama, "I've never seen someone who's better at talking to 10,000 people than to one." And Obama's view of him was sort of the opposite. Like, of course, everybody can get into like a deep personal conversation with Joe Biden, but nobody's going to show up at giant rallies for him the way that the Obama rallies were. But both of them got elected president.
Yeah, they did. They did. Now, does the race turn out the same way without all of the things that we experienced in 2020?
I don't know. The hypothetical history is, beyond me, I guess. But I think it's hard. Would Biden have won without it? There are reasons to believe yes, and there are reasons to believe no. But towards the end of the book, I quote some focus groups that were done for, the fabled Obama-Trump voters, right? These people who voted for Obama in 2008 and in 2012, and then voted for Trump in 2016. Mm-hmm. After the 2016 election, the Obama folks were really interested in how it was that there were such people. They didn't really believe that it made any sense. Mm-hmm. How could you vote for Barack Obama and Donald Trump? There's a connection that voters were making to both of them as outsiders, as shaking up the system, and at the end of the campaign, into September, October, they're doing a focus groups on them and seeing, these are the people now, Obama Trump voters who were undecided on Trump and Biden. Mm-hmm. And the basic gloss of what they said is about Trump, they'd say, like, I don't like him. But he does know how to do the economy. And once we get through the coronavirus, he probably could be the one to make the economy improve. But he does not seem like he could get us out of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
And they look at Biden and they say he's a good man. I don't know what he can do about the economy. That kind of freaks me out. And I do not know, like, again, these are these voters. They're like, what's going on in the left of the Democratic Party with defund the police and all this sort of stuff spooks me. But he seems like he's going to be able to get us out of the coronavirus. Right. Mm-hmm. And those voters broke more toward Biden than toward Trump. Right. So for those voters, certainly the pandemic was a deciding factor. What would they have thought if there wasn't the coronavirus? Who knows what we would have been talking about otherwise. But it certainly wasn't great for Donald Trump that the coronavirus existed.
No, not at all.
And to be clear, not just out of luck, I think people were watching his handling of the pandemic and being very concerned by what they were seeing.
Absolutely. So, going back to democracy for a minute, and I'm thinking about when you talk about Mitch McConnell being hesitant to sign the letter that is stating that there are some covert happening. Mm-hmm. And how do you protect democracy when you are trying to deal and work with someone like Mitch McConnell? Like, he knew that this was an issue. He knew it wasn't the CIA, but he saw an advantage, right?
Yeah, and I think that what you see here, and it's the book is about the Democrats, but there's a little bit about the Republicans in there. And towards the end, I think especially when you see what happened after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and there was this clearly, if you want to believe that what happened after Scalia died and the Senate not moving on Merrick Garland was a principle, if you want to make that argument, I don't think anybody credibly can. Right. Yeah. We all knew what was happening. They saw a chance to hold on to that seat, and they did. But let's say you take it. There is no way to then look at what happened after Ginsburg died and Amy Coney Barrett's appointment and pretend that also is by principle. So what happened then? If anybody was doubting that this was about seizing power on the court and holding power, then you can't. Those two incidents undercut each other because that was like a rush job to get something that, when they assumed that Trump was going to lose, and they wanted to make sure that he got to a point of justice. I do think that what the Republican Party we're seeing has largely become is about holding on to power. And sort of power for the sake of power and for the sake of being a check on the change that is going on in America. Right. That's not to say the Republican Party is fully that, or that it will be that going forward. But we have yet to see the Republican Party emerge as in the Trump years or in this post-Trump period as being about more than that. And I think we should hope there are a lot of Republicans in this country, and we should hope that Republican leaders are clearer on why exactly they want to be in power, right, and bring that message to voters and see if voters buy it. But right now, it does seem like the game is to stay in power.
Yeah. So I want to let, our viewers know that you can drop your questions in the chat, and we will take a few questions. So we have one from, do Democrats in 2020 still run against Trump? Or is it really about Dems' record of doing big things that help people or not?
Let's see what the circumstances of Trump are by 2022. We know that a grand jury has been convened here, convened in Manhattan to consider charges against the former president. We don't know what will happen to that. We don't know what will happen of his political standing overall. We do see, obviously, that it seems like the overall feeling of the Republican Party is to cleave closer to Trump than to cleave apart from Trump. And if that continues, then Trump will be a factor. But I think it's important for everybody to keep in mind that clearly things went better for the Republicans when Trump was on the ballot, right, rather than when he wasn't, right? 2016 and 2020 went better for the Republican Party with Trump there. 2018 did not go well for the Republican Party.
Right.
And look at that, what happened in the House. Nobody was expecting, Republicans, Democrats, anybody, that Republicans would pick up as many seats in the House in 2020 as they did. But they did in part because of Trump's coattails. And so does that work when he's not there drawing people to vote for him directly? I'm not sure. I do think the Biden presidency and the midterms and all that is sort of wrapped up in three things. One is, and it's one with two subsets of things. One is just the coronavirus overall. Are we going to actually be over the hump of this, or will there be outbreaks still? Will there be variants that become problems? A year from now, are we still sitting on Zoom calls, or are we back to normal? Even if it's like 6 months from now, where are we? And the two things that are subsets of that are, number one, whether what happens to the economy, whether the economy gets better, and number two, are schools open in the fall, right? And is there the normalcy of that, which of course relates to all sorts of things about working parents and everything about the economy and society. It seems like, with what we heard from the mayor of New York this week, saying that schools will be reopened there fully and in person, no more remote learning, that's pointing to what would have to be good news for Biden. Now, to the question also asked about talking about big things, look, the American Rescue Plan was big. The Democrats have not done such a great job of making people realize so far that that was the big thing that they did. And infrastructure could be big. And the families plan, the things like the child tax credit that they propose now, or if they get to a family leave law, those sorts of things, if they... Imagine a Democratic Party that could go into the midterms, which have a lot of things working against them. The historical trends of people, balancing power, gerrymandering, which is going to give the Republicans a leg up in House races for sure, and all of that. If the Democrats can go into next fall, with the economy in better shape, schools open, and the pandemic basically fading from memory at that point, plus being able to say, hey, look at all these projects around your district and all this stimulus money, like, that's a much better argument for Democrats to have than if any or all of those are not true.
Absolutely. But I wonder if they're missing it, because you just said that Democrats are not doing a great job of letting people know that the big thing was the American Rescue Plan. And it's the same thing that happened in 2009, 2010. They did a horrible job of letting people know how much they saved the country coming out of the financial crisis.
Yeah, and you see it as a problem for Democrats, in that even a lot of the Republicans who voted against the American Rescue Plan are talking in their districts about how great some of the things are that came. But to the voters, it seems politically incumbent on the Democrats to make the case, as the case is being made by some folks, including the DNC has been doing some work on this, to say, this is the bill that you guys voted against. Yeah.
And since you just mentioned the DNC, does Jamie Harrison feel like the infrastructure is stronger now than what Tom Perez came into?
Yeah, I mean, Tom Perez was very open with me and with others from early out of just what terrible shape, how much worse shape the DNC was in than even he realized. And you look at going into 2016, and I trace some of this in the book, of how the words benign neglect are used by Obama folks to describe his approach to the DNC. Not caring about it, sucking it dry of resources, leaving it with millions of dollars in debt. And what happened in the RNC was really much more efficient than what's happening in the DNC. Trump won in 2016 for a lot of reasons, but part of the reason why he won is because the RNC was putting together a lot of the operational work for him. And Tom Perez went in and he rebuilt a lot. And he if you care about the DNC, Perez deserves credit for sure for improving where things were. There's a memo that he writes to Jamie Harrison, that's towards the end of the book, where he talks about how like there are going to be days that are terrible for you, like don't survive them, but I hope that you will find that this place is in good shape, and certainly in better shape than I found it.
That's great. So this is your first book, and I have it so people can see it, since you didn't since you are doing a proof of life video today.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I hope it's more entertaining than a proof of life video.
It is. It's much more entertaining. So congratulations, it's your first book. So what about 2020 really excited you? And well, you decided, and did you say 2018?
Yeah, 2018 is when we sold the book proposal, yeah.
Okay, so you didn't know what you were going to have so much content to write about and review, and you've been on campaign trails for years. Why now?
It was clear that this was going to be a major election. The proposal says something like this is going to be the craziest election and the most important election in American history. I, of course, didn't know that any of this stuff was coming with the pandemic. But I think that we're in this really crucial moment for the country, where everybody needs to. There's a lot that's in the balance, and there was a lot that was in the balance in 2020. So many different things in so many different ways. There's this quote from Tom Hanks, the great scholar Tom Hanks, who is doing a fundraiser by Zoom that happened during the Democratic convention. And he says, remember, this is a guy who got COVID early, and he says, it's something, when you think about all the things that are going on, it's very Tom Hanks way. He says, that there's the health crisis and the racial reckoning and all the economic crisis, all these things, and that it's an election year, right? That we get to make a choice about what we want to do here. He says it makes you think maybe there's a nod to a higher power. You could think about how, look, George Floyd could have been killed any year. Didn't have to be a presidential election year, right? Obviously, there are Black men who have been killed constantly by police over the course of years. That video was, it's the video that changes it. The pandemic could have hit at any point. It hit this year. All this stuff coming together, made it so that 2020 really was, it becomes this just major moment in American history. I hope with the book, what you see here is all the things that were leading into it, and what it does for what it tells us about where we are for going forward. For Democrats to think about this is your party now. These are the leaders here. And by the way, like most of the people who are in the book are probably going to be with the party for a long time. We're at a point where, they should all live and be well a long time, but the leadership of the House, the three leaders of the House, Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn, are all around 80 years old. Joe Biden is 78 years old. Chuck Schumer is the spring chicken there, right? But there's a different generation coming. And it's these people. It's Kamala Harris. It's Pete Buttigieg. It's Cory Booker. It's all these people. It's not just the people who ran for president. There'll be others too. But a lot of people who came in 2018. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? By the way, Bernie Sanders. He's a couple months older than Biden. He's not going to be part of this for all that much longer, right? Elizabeth Warren is in her 70s, right? Like it's this new, all these new politics that are coming, but having to connect with what is the reality of Biden's win, which is that the country is not where some people thought it was. There's a moment in the book, a couple weeks after the election, most of the members of the squad, all three of them, minus Ayanna Pressley, and a couple of new members, Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, show up outside the DNC headquarters for a protest about the Green New Deal. And Ilhan Omar is speaking, and she mentions that her district had the highest turnout of any House district in the country. And she says, people have been coming up to me, my colleagues, and they've been saying, Ilhan, how do you do it? How did it happen? And she says, it happened because you have to give people something to believe in. And when they believe in it, they'll turn out to vote. Okay, here's the problem with that calculation for her. She's right then that the people were turning out to vote, and that actually operationally she had more going on than most people realize. And doing a door knocking campaign, was better at it. Often you see with ideological candidates who are known for their ideology more than anything else, as Omar and many others are, whichever way they are on the spectrum of ideology, tend not to think that much about operations and logistics of a campaign. Right. She did, but in that district, which is in Minnesota, in a swing state, and in the district where George Floyd was killed, right? It's a lot going on there. Right. Come back. That's Keith Ellison's old district.
Right.
In that district, that's the highest or the biggest drop off in the country, also between the votes for a presidential candidate, for the Democratic presidential candidate, and the votes for the Democratic House member. So people in Ilhan Omar's district showed up to vote for Joe Biden and not for Ilhan Omar. And you see that around the country. Joe Biden ran ahead of almost every Democrat, of Senate candidates, House candidates. And what that says is, on a basic level, his brand seems to actually be better than the Democratic Party's overall. And that's not, if I had said that to you 2 years ago, that like when I was among the people who would use terms like, is he out of sync with the Democratic Party? And he would get mad at me for writing things like that. And he one time confronted me over it. And it was like a really kind of weird, rough moment in Iowa. Stuck his finger in my face. But it turned out to be true. And that means that that's something that that the party needs to think about, that and maybe as a younger generation comes up, they won't think about things in the same way. And it's about older voters, or maybe people are not connecting with where sort of the squad politics are. I hear, and I'm sure you guys hear it too, from members of Congress, other politicians who say to me, not older people, younger people, say, I'm not convinced that we should be going toward, we're doing a little bit more towards socialism than we should be, or we're letting ourselves get painted as socialists more than we should be. That fight's going on at the same time that you have a lot of Democrats who are looking at this and saying, hey, the Republicans aren't going to work with Biden anyway. They're not going to work with us. They can't even sign on to a bipartisan commission to investigate the riot. Why do we even deal with them? And that's one of the big tensions that's happening right now.
Right. Okay. So you finished the book and you're ready to put it out, and I'm wondering where it leaves you. Are you hopeful? Do you want people to walk away hopeful? What are some of the takeaways that you really want to stick with people, and how should they feel about their country going forward?
I think people should still be concerned. I don't think that this process that we're going through is over at all. We're clearly in a dangerous moment still, in a lot of ways. What's going to happen with the pandemic? What's going to happen with the economy? It's not like George Floyd was killed and then everything got cleaned up. It was fine. Everything's fine since then, right? Right. And when you see the commitment that Donald Trump has, above all, to seeding doubts in democracy and in our country, it seems to be the great project of his post-presidency. Jimmy Carter went and built houses. Donald Trump's post-presidential project is undermining democracy. It's a lot. It's a lot to think about here. I don't know that at the end of this book, first of all, how I was at the end of the book was tired. Hopeful, or I think as a journalist, it's not like the reporter saying like, oh, it's an exciting story to cover. But I am, as a student of this, I think we should all be interested in it. But for me, not because like it's going to be a good story, although I hope that there are a lot of good stories in this book and it was entertaining throughout. But this is really, really important. And one of the things, that I set out to do in the book was I made myself a rule that I wasn't going to get into too much like staff gossip and all that sort of thing, because it just seemed actually kind of irrelevant to the bigger things that were going on here.
Right. Yes. Well, Isaac, thank you so much for writing the book. As a former advanced person and campaign person, it was very interesting for me to read. And I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. I know it's been a crazy day for you and for everyone. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you everyone for watching. If you want to tell people where to go to purchase the book or any last thoughts, please feel free to share.
Well, first of all, thank you to Jessica, to you, and to the Raben Group for hosting this. Robert has been in my ear on all sorts of things over the years, and so it seems appropriate. And the level of reading that I can see you did of that book, with all the pages that you've got marked up, is gratifying, although a little bit frightening. And I don't think anybody should be required to read it that closely necessarily, but if you do, that's great. But I'd love, I hope people will read it. If you go to the website that I have, which is just my name, Edward-Isaac Dovere, there's a sign up, and I can send a virtual sign-free bookplate sticker that you can stick in the book. And yeah, please buy the book. More importantly, first, before you get the bookplate sticker, whether it's at your local bookstore or on Amazon or on all the ways that you can get it. It's great Memorial Day weekend reading. It's great anytime reading, and there's a lot in there, a lot of stories that even as I was reporting them, I couldn't believe that they were all coming together. And then I would check them and be like, okay, I guess that's going in. And I hope it's both illuminating and entertaining.
It is. Thank you for writing it. I'm so glad to talk to you today, and thank you all for tuning in.